Imagine spending 4 years building the most powerful warship on the planet, a floating fortress over 800 feet long, armed with guns that can hurl a shell the weight of a family car over 20 miles. A ship so enormous, so heavily armored, that your enemy calls an emergency meeting in Parliament just because it exists. Now imagine never actually using it. It never won a single significant naval battle, never changing the outcome of the war by even one day. That is the story of the Tirpitz. And the strange thing is, the Tirpitz didn't fail because it was a bad ship. It failed because it was too good, too valuable, too feared. And that fear, that obsession to protect it, turned the most dangerous battleship Germany ever built into a prisoner, a ghost, a very expensive piece of floating furniture that the Allies spent 3 years trying to sink, and that Hitler spent 3 years refusing to risk. This is the story of how one ship terrified an entire ocean, never really fought, and still managed to lose a war. Let's go back to the beginning, back to the 1930s, when Germany was rebuilding its military from scratch, and the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had a problem. Britain had the most powerful naval force in the world. The Royal Navy had been dominant for over a century. It had won at Trafalgar. It had strangled Germany in the First World War with a blockade that literally starved millions of civilians. And if Germany was going to fight Britain again, it needed to find a way to challenge that dominance at sea. The man in charge of this problem was Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, and Raeder had a plan, not to match the Royal Navy ship for ship. Germany didn't have the time, the money, or the industrial base for that. Instead, Raeder wanted to use a handful of powerful, fast surface ships to disrupt Britain's supply lines. Britain was an island. Almost everything it needed to fight a war, oil, food, weapons, steel, soldiers, had to arrive by ship across the Atlantic Ocean. Cut those supply lines, and Britain would choke. The strategy was called commerce warfare, or in German, Handelskrieg. The idea was simple. You send your biggest, fastest battleships out into the Atlantic. They hunt down convoys. They sink supply ships. They force Britain to divert enormous resources to hunt your battleships down. And while Britain is busy chasing your ships around the ocean, Germany is squeezing the life out of British industry and the British people. To execute this plan, Raeder needed ships, and the German shipyards delivered 2 of the finest and 2 of the last great battleships ever built. The first was the Bismarck. The second was her sister ship, the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz was laid down in Hamburg in 1936 and launched in April 1939, just 5 months before Germany invaded Poland and started the Second World War. She was massive. At full load, she displaced over 52,000 tons. That's heavier than most aircraft carriers of the era. Her main armament was 8 15-inch guns, arranged in 4 twin turrets. She carried 12 6-inch secondary guns, 16 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and by the end of her life, literally hundreds of smaller anti-aircraft weapons. Her armor belt was over 12 inches thick. She could travel at 30 knots, faster than almost anything the Allies had that could match her firepower. The numbers were terrifying, but numbers don't tell the whole story. To understand why the Tirpitz mattered so much to both sides, you have to understand the strategic situation in 1941. By the spring of 1941, Britain was fighting almost alone. France had fallen. The Soviet Union was still technically neutral. The United States had not yet entered the war. Britain's lifeline was the Atlantic, specifically the convoys of merchant ships that crossed from North America carrying food, fuel, weapons, and equipment. There were hundreds of ships making this crossing every month, and they were being hunted. German U-boats were already devastating those convoys. Hundreds of ships were going down every month. But U-boats, as effective as they were, had limitations. They couldn't always find convoys in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. They couldn't outrun destroyers in a straight chase, and they were vulnerable to aircraft and surface escorts. What Raeder wanted was to combine the U-boat campaign with a surface radar campaign, big battleships working with submarines. Catch a conv, sink the escorts with the battleship's guns, then let the U-boats massacre the helpless merchantmen. It was a nightmare scenario for the Royal Navy, and in May 1941, it almost came true. The Bismarck sailed in May 1941. Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise, was the most ambitious German surface operation of the entire war. The Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen would break out into the Atlantic, link up with other German ships, and begin the systematic destruction of Britain's supply lifeline. What happened next is one of the most dramatic naval stories of the entire Second World War. The Bismarck sank the HMS Hood, at that time the largest warship in the Royal Navy, in a matter of minutes. A lucky shell, or maybe not so lucky depending on your perspective, hit the Hood's magazine. She blew up so completely that out of a crew of over 1,400 men, only 3 survived. 3. Britain was shocked, horrified, and then absolutely furious. The Royal Navy threw almost everything it had at the Bismarck. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers. They hunted her across the North Atlantic for 3 days. A swordfish torpedo bomber from the carrier HMS Ark Royal hit the Bismarck's rudder, leaving her sailing in helpless circles. The British battleships HMS Rodney and HMS King George V closed in and pounded her into a wreck. Bismarck went down on the 27th of May 1941 with over 2,000 men. Now, while all this was happening, where was the Tirpitz? In port, still working up, still not ready for combat operations. She watched the entire drama from a distance, still being fitted out, still training her crew, still not ready to go to war. The Bismarck's loss was a catastrophe, not just in terms of men and metal, but in terms of strategy. It proved that the Royal Navy could and would devote overwhelming force to hunting down German surface raiders. It proved that a breakout into the Atlantic was an enormous gamble, and it changed Hitler's attitude toward his big ships forever. Hitler was not a naval man. He didn't understand the sea the way he understood tanks and aircraft. And after the Bismarck, he became almost paranoid about risking his remaining big ships. He was obsessed with prestige. These ships, the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau, the Prince Eugen, were symbols of German power and technological achievement. Losing them would be a propaganda disaster. Losing the Bismarck had been bad enough. He was not going to lose the Tirpitz. So when the Tirpitz finally became operational in early 1941, instead of sending her into the Atlantic, as Reeder had intended, Hitler sent her north, to Norway. At first glance, this made some strategic sense. Norway was important. Britain had been trying to attack it. The convoys carrying supplies to the Soviet Union, which Germany had invaded in June 1941, had to pass along the Norwegian coast. And a battleship sitting in a Norwegian fjord was a constant threat, a fleet in being. Even if it never sailed, the Royal Navy had to plan as if it might. But there was another reason. Norway, with its deep, narrow fjords, was one of the few places in the world where a ship like the Tirpitz could actually hide. Tucked into a fjord, surrounded by mountains, camouflaged with netting, protected by anti-aircraft guns on the surrounding cliffs, the Tirpitz would be very difficult to attack and very difficult to sink. And so one of the most powerful battleships ever built went into hiding. Not immediately. There was one real combat sortie in 1942, but that mission ended before it even properly started, for reasons that tell you everything you need to know about what this ship's life was going to be like. In March 1942, the Tirpitz finally sailed. Her target was Convoy PQ-12, a convoy of 17 merchant ships heading to the Soviet Union with war supplies. It was exactly the kind of target the Tirpitz had been built to destroy. The Germans found the convoy. They got close, and then an air attack from the carrier HMS Victorious nearly hit the Tirpitz. Nearly. No torpedoes connected. But the attack spooked the Germans badly enough that the Tirpitz turned around and ran back to Norway without attacking the convoy. 17 merchant ships got through. The most powerful battleship in the German Navy had failed to sink a single one of them. And that was basically it. That was, in any meaningful offensive sense, the Tirpitz's only real attempt to actually do what she was built to do. But the story gets stranger. Even though the Tirpitz was sitting in a fjord doing nothing, she was still terrifying the British. This is the incredible paradox at the heart of the Tirpitz story. A ship that wasn't fighting was still winning. Here's how it worked. The Royal Navy knew where the Tirpitz was. They had intelligence reports, aircraft reconnaissance, and spy networks in Norway. They knew she was sitting in Trondheim or Kafjord or Fjoord, depending on the time of year. But they couldn't be sure she'd stay there. They couldn't be sure she wouldn't suddenly appear in the Atlantic. And the possibility of the Tirpitz breaking out was so catastrophically dangerous that the Royal Navy had to treat it as a constant, real threat. The result was that enormous British naval resources were tied up watching and worrying about a ship that wasn't going anywhere. Multiple battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were kept in Scapa Flow, the great Royal Navy base in Scotland, specifically to intercept the Tirpitz if she ever decided to make a run for the Atlantic, resources that could have been deployed elsewhere, to the Pacific, to the Mediterranean, to the Indian Ocean, were instead sitting in Scotland, waiting for a ship that was sitting in Norway. It gets worse. In July 1942, the Tirpitz's mere existence caused one of the worst disasters in the history of the Arctic convoys. Convoy PQ-17. 35 merchant ships were heading to the Soviet Union, carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and thousands of vehicles. Protected by a massive escort including cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, with a distant covering force of battleships that included the USS Washington and HMS Duke of York. Intelligence reached the Admiralty that the Tirpitz, along with the Scharnhorst and several cruisers, had sailed from their Norwegian anchorages. The German surface fleet was at sea. The Tirpitz was heading for the convoy. The order came from the First Sea Lord, Dudley Pound, personally. The convoy was to scatter. Every merchant ship was to make for a Soviet port independently, at best speed, without escort. It was a catastrophe. Spread across hundreds of miles of the Barents Sea with no protection, the merchant ships were hunted down one by German aircraft and U-boats. 24 of the 35 ships were sunk. Over 150 aircraft were lost. Over 3,000 tanks and nearly 4,000 vehicles, which the Soviets desperately needed, went to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And the Tirpitz, she turned around and went back to port. She never found the convoy. She never even got close to the merchant ships. She had already gone home by the time the killing started. The Tirpitz didn't fire a single gun at a single Allied ship, but her existence, her threat, her possibility, had caused the greatest single loss of Allied shipping in a single conv in the entire war. That is the terrifying power of a fleet in being. You don't have to fight, you just have to exist. But you can't win a war by existing, and back in Germany, the arguments were getting louder. Reeder wanted to use the surface fleet. He believed the big ships could still change the war. Hitler disagreed, and in late 1942, an incident finally ended the argument for a while. Operation Regenbogen, in December 1942, the Hipper and the Lutzow attacked convoy JW-51B in the Barents Sea. The attack was a disaster. Poor coordination, bad weather, and aggressive British destroyer attacks. The Germans sank one destroyer and one minesweeper, but the British escorts drove off the German cruisers. A brilliant piece of defensive fighting, but from Hitler's perspective, an unforgivable humiliation. He heard the news on the radio before the Kriegsmarine had even given him a full report. He exploded. He ranted for hours at Reeder. He demanded that the big ships be decommissioned. He wanted their guns removed and installed on land fortifications. He said the surface fleet was useless, a waste of resources, a national embarrassment. Reeder resigned shortly afterward. He was replaced by Admiral Karl Dönitz, the U-boat commander, who had exactly the opposite view of naval strategy. Dönitz believed in submarines. He thought the surface ships were millstones. He had no love for the great battleships. The big ships were spared decommissioning, but the writing was on the wall. The German surface fleet would become even more passive, even more defensive, even more trapped in its Norwegian fjords. The Allies, meanwhile, were desperate to sink the Tirpitz, not because she was doing anything, precisely because she might. Every month she existed was another month those British battleships had to sit in Scapa Flow. Every month she existed was another month of convoys being routed the long way around, with extra escorts at enormous cost. And so began one of the most extraordinary campaigns of the entire war, a multi-year effort to kill a ship that wouldn't come out and fight. The Tirpitz had to be brought to battle on the Allies' terms, in her fjord, under her camouflage nets, surrounded by her anti-aircraft defenses. The first attempts were almost suicidal. In October 1942, a small commando operation tried to get close enough to attach explosive charges to the Tirpitz's hull. Brave men in kayaks paddling through Norwegian waters. The mission failed. The men were captured. Some were executed. In September 1943, two X-craft midget submarines, about 50 feet long, crewed by 4 men, actually got through the defenses and placed explosive charges under the Tirpitz's keel. This was extraordinary, remarkable bravery and seamanship. The charges went off. The Tirpitz was badly damaged. She was knocked off her moorings. Equipment was wrecked. Some of her guns were damaged. The men who laid the charges were captured, but they were treated as prisoners of war. The Tirpitz was knocked out of action for 6 months. 6 months of repairs. She was still afloat, still dangerous, still there, but she had been hurt. Then came the air attacks. Multiple raids by the fleet air arm. Torpedo bombers sweeping in low over the fjords. Most of them failed. The defenses were too strong, the terrain too difficult, the smoke screens too thick. The Tirpitz was specifically designed to survive torpedo attacks anyway. Her compartmentalization was extraordinary. Flooding one section of the hull would slow her, but probably not sink her. But the attacks kept coming. Because the Allies couldn't afford to stop. They couldn't afford to let the Tirpitz sit there, intact, dangerous, a threat that tied down resources and terrified convoy planners. In April 1944, Operation Tungsten, a massive fleet air arm raid, over 40 Barracuda dive bombers escorted by more than 80 fighters. They caught the Tirpitz just as she was emerging from a smoke screen and hit her 14 times with bombs. 14 hits. The damage was severe. Over 300 men were killed or wounded. But the Tirpitz didn't sink. She was armored against exactly this kind of attack. She was damaged, but she was still afloat. 6 more attacks followed over the summer of 1944. Most of them failed. The smoke screens were almost impenetrable. The Norwegian terrain is incredibly difficult. The anti-aircraft fire was withering. The Tirpitz seemed invulnerable. Then came the tallboys. Barnes Wallis, the same genius who designed the bouncing bombs that destroyed the Ruhr dams in 1943, had been working on something different. A bomb so heavy, so aerodynamically perfect, that it would fall faster than the speed of sound and hit with the force of a small earthquake. He called it the tallboy. It weighed 12,000 pounds, 12,000 pounds, 6 tons, and it wasn't designed to hit a ship. It was designed to go through a ship, through the armor, through the hull, through everything, and detonate deep in the water beside the keel, creating a cavitation bubble that would break the ship's back. To carry these bombs, RAF Bomber Command used specially modified Avro Lancasters, stripped of everything non-essential to carry the enormous weight. The unit assigned to the job was 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. In September 1944, 15 Lancasters took off from a base in the Soviet Union. They couldn't carry the bombs all the way from Britain and back, so they used Yagodnik near Arkhangelsk as a forward base. They found the Tirpitz through a break in the clouds. One tallboy scored a direct hit near the bow. It punched through the armor plate and detonated deep inside the ship. The bow was wrecked. The Tirpitz was flooded forward, unable to steam, unable to fight at full effectiveness. But she still didn't sink. The Germans made a decision. They would tow the Tirpitz south to Tromsø, where she could be used as a static floating battery. They couldn't repair her properly anymore. Germany was losing the war on all fronts. Resources were running short, but a floating gun platform in a Norwegian fjord could still be useful. Maybe. Moving her to Tromsø was a mistake. It moved her further south, closer to Britain. Now, for the first time, Lancasters flying from Scotland could reach the Tirpitz and get back. You didn't need to stage from the Soviet Union anymore. On the 12th of November, 1944, 29 Lancaster bombers of 617 Squadron and 9 Squadron took off from Lossiemouth in Scotland. It was a clear day. There were no clouds over Tromsø. No smoke screen, the Germans had run out of smoke canisters. No fighter protection, the Luftwaffe unit that was supposed to be protecting the Tirpitz had been moved, and no one had thought to move it back. The Lancasters flew in from the southeast. The German crews saw them coming. The Tirpitz opened fire with everything she had, but the tallboys were already falling. 2 direct hits, 2 near misses so close they were almost as damaging as hits. The cavitation effect that Barnes-Wallis had designed tore the bottom out of the ship. The Tirpitz began to capsize. She rolled onto her side in less than 10 minutes. An enormous explosion, probably from her forward magazine, blew a hole in her hull as she lay on her side. She settled on the bottom of the fjord in shallow water, her hull visible above the surface, listing at 135 degrees. Out of a crew of over 1,700 men, approximately 950 died. Some were rescued when Norwegian workers cut through the upturned hull. Some survived in air pockets. Most did not. The greatest battleship in the German Navy was gone. When the news reached Britain, there was relief, of course, but there was also something strange, a kind of anticlimactic feeling, because the Tirpitz, in the end, had never really done what she was supposed to do. She had never sailed into the Atlantic. She had never smashed a convoy. She had never challenged the Royal Navy in open battle. She had spent her operational life in Norwegian fjords, being attacked, being repaired, hiding, and occasionally threatening to do things she never actually did. So was she a failure? Was the whole project a waste? The answer is complicated, and this is where the real lesson of the Tirpitz lies. Look at the resources the Allies had to devote to killing her. Years of effort, multiple commands, X-craft submarines, fleet air arm strikes costing aircraft and aircrew, Lancaster bombers and their crews, intelligence operations, reconnaissance missions, and planning sessions at the highest levels of Allied command. Churchill personally monitored the Tirpitz situation. The Admiralty had dedicated staff whose job was essentially to think about the Tirpitz. Look at the Arctic convoy disaster. 24 ships sunk, not by the Tirpitz, but because of her. Look at the British battleships sitting in Scapa Flow for years, their crews growing frustrated, their maintenance costing money because they might be needed to intercept the Tirpitz. In cold, hard strategic terms, the Tirpitz achieved more by not fighting than most warships achieve in their entire careers. She was a permanent, enormous drain on Allied resources. She influenced convoy routes. She shaped Allied strategy. She pinned down capital ships that could have been used elsewhere. The German Navy knew this. Reeder knew this. His staff officers knew this. A ship that stays in port, well-positioned and well-protected, forces the enemy to react to its presence. It constrains their options. It ties down their forces. It creates uncertainty and fear. But there's another side to this argument, and it's the side that the German sailors themselves understood. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, but widely told among naval historians, of a German sailor on the Tirpitz looking at the mountains surrounding Fjord and saying that they had become a prison, not a fortress, that the mountains weren't protecting the Tirpitz, they were trapping her. And that gets to the heart of the Tirpitz tragedy. The ship was built to fight, her crew trained to fight. Every man on board knew what the ship was capable of. They had seen the specifications. They had practiced the drills. They had watched dummy targets through their rangefinders and imagined what a real engagement would look like. And instead they sat in a fjord, month after month, being bombed, being repaired, being bombed again, watching their war from the inside of the mountains, waiting for orders that never came. The morale on the Tirpitz was not good. The crew was large, over 2,500 men at full complement. Keeping that many men busy and motivated in a ship that wasn't going anywhere was a challenge. There were training exercises, maintenance work, drills, and inspections, but it wasn't the same as actually being at war, and the men knew it. Officers who served on the Tirpitz later described a feeling of wasted potential, of being held back, of being protected so carefully that the protection had become the purpose. The ship existed to protect itself. It was a circular logic that ate away at the sense of mission. And then there were the political dimensions. Hitler's relationship with his surface ships was toxic. He admired them as symbols, but feared them as weapons. He wanted them to project power without actually being put at risk. He wanted the prestige of having a Tirpitz without the danger of losing one. That's not a strategy, that's vanity. After the Barents Sea fiasco in December 1942, Hitler's fury with the surface fleet was such that he seriously proposed stripping the guns from all his big ships and using them to defend the Norwegian coast. Dönitz talked him out of it, but only just, and only by arguing that the ships still had value as a fleet in being, not as fighters, but as threats. This tells you something profound about the failure of German naval strategy in the Second World War. The surface fleet was built for a war of movement and aggression. Reeder's Z-Plan, the grand expansion scheme approved in 1939, envisioned a massive German fleet that would genuinely challenge the Royal Navy for Atlantic supremacy by the mid-1940s. But the war started before the plan was finished. Germany went to war with a surface fleet that was too small to fight the British in open battle, but too large and too valuable to risk in the kind of aggressive raiding operations that might actually have worked. It was the worst of both worlds, too big to throw away, too small to win. Compare this to how the Japanese used their big ships. The Yamato, actually the largest battleship ever built, bigger even than the Tirpitz, was sent on a suicide mission in April 1945. Operation Tengo. The Yamato was given just enough fuel to reach Okinawa, where she was supposed to beach herself and fight as a static gun platform until she was destroyed. She was sunk by American aircraft before she even got there. Was that a better use of a great battleship? In pure strategic terms, arguably yes. It was a gesture, it was pointless, but at least the Yamato was trying. At least she went out to meet her fate instead of hiding in a fjord. There's something to be said for a ship that fights and loses versus a ship that hides and survives, only to be blown apart anyway. The Tirpitz chose the fjord. The Yamato chose the sea. Neither survived, but history remembers them differently. The Tirpitz is also a story about the limits of technology. Here was a ship that represented the absolute pinnacle of battleship design. Every technical advance in armor, weapons, propulsion, and fire control had been incorporated into her design. She was, by any reasonable measure, the most sophisticated warship Germany had ever built. And she was made obsolete almost immediately, not by another battleship, by aircraft. The Fleet Air Arm attacks of 1944 couldn't sink her, but they could damage her badly enough to knock her out of action for months. And the tallboys, those extraordinary weapons, eventually finished her off. A battleship that could survive hits from almost any conventional weapon was sunk by a bomb designed to exploit the one weakness that all conventional ships share, the fact that water doesn't compress. The era of the battleship was already ending when the Tirpitz was launched. Aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the capital ships of naval warfare. The Bismarck was sunk by torpedo bombers from a carrier. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse was sunk by Japanese land-based aircraft in December 1941. At Pearl Harbor, battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet were smashed while still in port by carrier-based aircraft. The Tirpitz was a weapon system that was becoming obsolete before she could even prove herself. In a different war, in a different decade, maybe she would have found her moment. But in the Second World War, the ocean belonged to aircraft and submarines, not to big-gun surface ships. There's a final dimension to the Tirpitz story that deserves attention, the human dimension. When she capsized in Tromsø Fjord on November 12, 1944, around 950 men went down with her. Or rather, went sideways with her. She capsized rather than sinking straight down, and her hull was visible above the water. Rescuers could hear men trapped in the upturned hull. Norwegian workers were brought in with cutting equipment, and over the following days, they cut through the steel plating and pulled out survivors. About 80 men were rescued this way. Think about what that was like, trapped inside an upturned battleship. In November, in Norway, in freezing water, the sounds of cutting tools above you, not knowing if they'd reach you in time, not knowing if the hull would hold, not knowing how long the air would last. And all of this for a ship that had been sent to hide in a fjord. For men who had spent years waiting for a battle that never came, only to die in the most passive, the most helpless, the most un-naval way imaginable. These men are the real tragedy of the Tirpitz. They were professional sailors, trained and ready to fight, who were given a ship that was never allowed to fight. They maintained her, repaired her, defended her, lived aboard her for years, and died in her when she was finally and irreversibly destroyed. Most of them were very young. Most of them had no choice about where they served or what their ship was ordered to do. They deserved better. The ship deserved better. Even in war, even in a cause as monstrous as Nazi Germany's, individual sailors deserved to be used, if that's the word, more honestly than the Tirpitz's crew was used. So what is the legacy of the Tirpitz? What does her story actually mean? First, it's a lesson in the psychology of power. Hitler's paralysis when it came to risking his big ships wasn't stupidity. It was a very human fear of loss. We protect what we value most, and the more we protect it, the more valuable it becomes, and the more afraid we are to risk it. The Tirpitz was too important to use, which meant she was useless. That's not a military failure, it's a psychological one. Second, it's a lesson in the limits of deterrence. A fleet in being does work. The Tirpitz genuinely constrained British strategy. She genuinely influenced Allied decisions, but deterrence without the credible threat of action eventually becomes a bluff. By 1943, the British knew the Tirpitz wasn't coming out. They could reduce their precautions. They could divert resources elsewhere. The threat had been called. Third, it's a lesson in technological transition. The Tirpitz was built in one era and fought, or rather, didn't fight, in another. The battleship age had passed. The carrier age had arrived. No amount of armor or firepower could fix the fundamental problem that a battleship couldn't project force as far as a carrier, couldn't defend itself against aircraft nearly as well as it could defend itself against other ships, and couldn't sink submarines at all. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, it's a lesson in the relationship between strategy and will. Germany had a strategy for the Tirpitz. Reeder had a plan: commerce warfare, fleet in being, Atlantic raiding. The strategy was sound, but it required will. It required the acceptance of risk, and Hitler would not accept the risk. Without will, strategy is just paper. Without the willingness to use your weapons, they are just metal. The Tirpitz lies in Tromsø Fjord today. Parts of her were scrapped after the war. Norwegian and German salvage companies dismantled most of her over the following years, but some sections of her hull remain on the seabed, too deep or too difficult to recover. The fjord that was supposed to protect her became her grave. Tourists visit the site. There is a small memorial nearby. In the winters, when the fjord is dark and cold and the northern lights flicker overhead, it's hard not to think about those men. The ones who spent years waiting. The ones who died in the capsized hull. The ones who survived and came home to a Germany in ruins, haunted by the memory of a ship that was meant to change the war and changed nothing. The Tirpitz was the greatest battleship Germany ever built. She was one of the most formidable warships ever to sail. She terrified an empire. She reshaped naval strategy without firing a shot in anger. She was never sunk in battle because she never fought a battle. She died at anchor on a clear morning in November under the shadow of Norwegian mountains. Far from the Atlantic, she was built to dominate. The Tirpitz Trap was not a trap set by the Allies. It was a trap set by fear, by the fear of loss, by the fear of risk, by the belief that the value of a weapon comes from its existence rather than its use. Hitler built the perfect prison and called it a battleship. And the sea, in the end, was not impressed.